Hello, I'm Sebastian Michael, and this is this Saturday's sonnet. To me, fair friend, you never can be old, for as you were when first your eye I eyed, such seems your beauty still. 3 winters cold have from the forest shook 3 summers' pride, 3 beauteous springs to yellow autumn turned, in process of the seasons have I seen, 3 April perfumes in 3 hot Junes burned, since first I saw you fresh, which yet are green. Ah, yet doth beauty like a dial hand steal from his figure, and no pace perceived. So your sweet hue, which methinks still doth stand, hath motion, and mine eye may be deceived. For fear of which, hear this, thou age unbred. Ere you were born, was beauty's summer dead. And this is the glorious Sonnet 104. I have been promising you for a little while now a sonnet which will give us an idea of how long the relationship between the poet and the fair youth is going on for. Now, let me tell you straight away that there are scholars who say this sonnet does not do so. I think obviously it does. I think this is the clue we were waiting for when we get to hear precisely how long the relationship has gone on for 3 years. This to me seems absolutely clear and really obvious, and it seems to me almost nonsensical to argue with it. But I want to tell you that there are people who say, well, in classical poetry, in the tradition of the sonnet, there have been other sonneteers, there have been other poets who have invoked the 3 years cycle as a maturing of love, and that therefore the fact that it appears in this poem does not prove anything. And this is true in as much as it certainly isn't proof. Whenever we talk about these sonnets, whatever we say about them, it is essentially the words we have and what we make of the words. Everything is conjecture except the words. And how we read these words, how we understand them, even that comes very much down to us. And of course it comes down a little bit to what we actually want to hear. And I confess that what I want to hear is a proper story. I love the idea, of course, that Shakespeare and this young man are having a long-lasting relationship that goes through the ups and downs, through the trials and tribulations, through the turbulence of jealousy, of forgiveness, everything that we've been talking about for quite a few weeks now. That makes sense, but it also seems reflected in the poetry, in the sequence that we have. So to me, it makes no sense to question the validity of the time frame that is here given, because we find very little reason to question many of the other things that the poems give us. You can question all of them. You can always say, well, maybe this is just in the poet's mind, maybe this is just a fantasy, maybe this is just a dream he has, maybe this is just wishful thinking. All of these things are possible. Similarly, it is possible, in theory at least, that the 3 years which I, the poet here, refer to, and I address the youth and say, look, I've known you now for 3 years, and you are still as young and as fresh and as beautiful to me as when I first saw you. It is possible that I'm just making this up. It is possible that I'm just drawing from the existing literature and references of poetry and throw this into the mix casually because I can't think of anything better to do. Is it likely? You will remember that I have been saying also quite a few times that in the absence of certainty, likelihood is our friend. What is the likely scenario? Is it likely that I have been pouring out my heart over and over again, and not even in a particularly predictable way, not in a straight line? I mean, interestingly, we're just about to get to this. What's happening in this week's batch, or what leads up to this particular sonnet, is one of the most unusual patterns in the whole sequence. all of the sonnets we've read so far, and all of the ones we've talked about so far, give us something really quite specific. Sometimes there's a group and they go off a little bit on a tangent, or sometimes there's a group that you think, oh well, this is a little bit generic, but there's a waveform, and there is certainly not a repeated pattern that just goes on and on, that repeats itself, or that just borrows from other references. And so to me, it seems pretty obvious and pretty likely in the context of what we have that this sonnet, much as all the others, is an expression of where the poet is at the time. I do not see any proof for this not being the case, and so I do not see any strong, compelling reasons to deny the factuality of this sonnet. But I'm telling you that some people, some scholars, have written in their books that, oh, this may just be what a poet writes when he feels like doing so. You can tell what I think about this. So how do we get here to where we are now? You may remember the last time we talked, there was a separation. From you have I been absent in the spring. It was the spring, but it felt like winter because I've been away from you for so long. There was a separation, and this sense of separation, well, this is not just a sense, this, again, factuality of separation, why would it not be a fact? Why would he invent this? Is now reinforced in this week's batch. We start off with number 99, where I, the poet, refer to various flowers, and I chide the violet, and I go on a little bit about how different flowers have taken, for example, their beautiful smell, their fragrance from your sweet breath. And so it's this feels a little bit like the kind of poem that you could quite possibly argue is really an exercise in nice poetry writing. It doesn't feel to me, personally, this is a very personal statement, it doesn't feel to me like it comes right from the heart and expresses a necessary thing that the poet just has to say now because it's just so urgent. Number 99 doesn't feel like a particularly urgent sonnet to me. It feels a bit like a playful, like a literary playfulness. And then we go into a block of sonnets, 100, 101, 102 and 103, which I think are quite odd. This is an expression of, not even an opinion. I don't even express this as an opinion, I express this as a feeling I get. They're a little bit odd because you have me, the poet, here telling myself off in a way and admonishing my muse in a way for being absent and for not producing any more poetry right at the moment. And this happens in the first couple of this block of 4, in 100 and 101, and then in 102 I almost give an explanation. I make an excuse, really. I think it's fair to say I make an excuse for not writing poetry. And this, we can imagine, must be over a period of time. We know they're separate, we know they have been separated, and clearly there is now a period of time where I don't produce any sonnets, because I say, my love is strengthened, though more weak in seeming. I love not less, though less the show appear. And then I explain that if you repeat the same thing over and over again too much, it sort of loses its potency. I go as far as saying sweets grown common lose their dear delight. And I conclude this particular sonnet 102 by saying, therefore I sometimes hold my tongue, I sometimes keep quiet, because I would not dull you with my song. And then in number 103, I again have a complaint about me and my muse, really, if you like, by saying, oh, what poverty my muse brings forth. So I've been writing these poems now about not writing poems, and what comes out, well, what comes out is quite poor poetry, I seem to be saying myself. And the conclusion I draw in this particular one is, well, I cannot improve on your beauty. You are as beautiful in a way as it gets. Look in your glass. There's an echo to a sonnet very, very early on, where I also encourage the youth to look at himself in the mirror. Here I say, look in your glass, and there appears a face that overgoes my blunt invention quite. So I say, well, my poetry can't rise to the challenge of making you more beautiful, or even coming close to being as beautiful, to describing your beauty in the way that does you justice. And so what we are at is a point in the proceedings where we glean from the sonnets that there has been a separation. There's been a separation that felt painful to me, the poet. It felt like winter. But nevertheless, far from filling this emptiness and void with writing beautiful poetry, I've obviously been neglecting my loved one, my beloved, and I've not been sending him any more poems, or certainly not with the frequency that previously I had. So there's a slowing down, you could say, in the relationship. Now, what we don't know, of course, is whether this batch of sonnets, this explaining myself and saying, well, I sometimes go a little bit quiet because I don't want to dull you with my song, whether this is in response to the young man complaining about there not being any poetry, or whether this just comes out of my own sense that I've been neglecting my love. Either way, we get a sense, certainly quite strongly, that this is not the first flush of excitement. This is not the point at which I cannot get enough words out to say how wonderful you are. This is not the point at which I overflow with poetry that just springs from a well of love and adoration. This is a period where there's some silence and some absence and some distance, and also clearly, very clearly, an emotional distance. These few sonnets here sound dutiful more than anything else. And then comes 104, and 104 changes the tone again. And you know that I get excited whenever the tone changes, because I think when the tone changes, that means something in the relationship is changing, or something is happening. And 104 sounds almost to me, not almost, it sounds quite strongly like a response to something that has been said. It may not be. We don't know, as you realize. So often we simply don't know. But it sounds a little bit to me like a response to something. So something has come from the young man. What could have come from the young man? We don't know. But what I say is, to me, fair friend, you never can be old. And then I explain why. For as you were when first your eye I eyed, such seems your beauty still. And so this suggests that maybe the young man has said, oh well, you know, now that I'm growing out of the flush of youth, now that I'm growing up, as it were, now that I'm older, and that it shows, you don't love me anymore, or not as much as you used to, or I'm no longer attractive to you. You can kind of imagine a little bit what might have come from the young man. Also, we know him a bit, don't we? He can be quite petulant, he can be a bit focused on himself, he can be a little bit demanding, all of which is conjecture, please. Remember, this is all things that I'm reading into the context here, but we can imagine this being the case, can't we? And what comes from me, the poet, now is, after a block of maybe 4 or 5 poems which didn't feel very personal, which didn't seem to express anything particularly new, here comes something really quite new. Because here comes reassurance, an acknowledgement that time has passed, and also a fairly wise insight, which is that you seem to be not changing at all, but really you are. And I am aware of it, and I don't quite know what to say to this, other than there will not be anybody as beautiful, certainly not as beautiful to me, as you are now. So what does it mean, Sonnet 104? To me, fair friend, you never can be old. For as you were when first your eye I eyed, such seems your beauty still. The first sentence ends in the middle of a line. He doesn't do that very often, Shakespeare. To me, fair friend, it's obvious, you never can be old. For as you were when first your eyed, just admire the poetry, when first your eye. Not when I first clapped eyes on you, not when I first saw you, not when we first met, not when first your eyed. Oh, I love it. Such seems your beauty still. I don't need to explain this. 3 winters cold, 3 winters cold. Not 2 winters, not 1 winter, not 7 winters, not 4, not 3.5, 3 winters cold. Have from the forest shook 3 summers' pride. In other words, the summer's pride is the beauty of the summer, is the strength and the sap of the summer. We have noted before how the word pride also has potentially sexual connotations. I don't know whether we need to read this into here now. I'm not particularly fussed about it. Certainly, it's a strong word, it's a positive word, definitely. And in more literal way, the pride of the forest, of course, is the foliage, is the fullness of the foliage, the fullness of the leaves and the strength of the trees. And that has been shaken off by 3 winters. 3 beauteous springs to yellow autumn turn. And the interesting thing here from a poetry perspective is that in the sequence of events in England, of course, winter doesn't follow summer, winter follows autumn, and autumn doesn't follow spring, autumn follows summer. But Shakespeare here draws a cross configuration where he says the winters shake the summer out of the forest, and the beauteous spring turns into yellow autumn. In process of the seasons have I seen. So in process, in the unfolding of the seasons, I have seen this. All of which simply means 3 years have passed. And I leave it up to you whether you think this is a generic poetic device, or whether you think, yeah, that makes sense. It sounds like about 3 years have passed, actually. We are on 104. We don't know, of course, as I've said before, how frequently I, the poet, write these sonnets, but 104 sonnets over 3 years sounds about right, actually, especially if we assume, as we not only have to assume, but as we know, because it says so in the words, that there are periods of separation. There are times during which the frequency drops. So there are times when there is intensive poetry writing, there are times when there are gaps. And we've just had one of these periods when there have been gaps, amounting in total to 3 years. That would be on average 1 every about 1.5 weeks or so, which is reasonable at a time when there's no email, no texting, no WhatsApp, no Snapchat, no first-class mail, no second-class mail, no motorbike couriers, no bicycle couriers for that matter. If you want to take a sonnet to your loved one, you have to put it on a horse with somebody, or you have to take it there to him yourself. So on average, over 3 years, 1 sonnet every 1.5 weeks. That is not unreasonable. That sounds actually pretty much exactly what we would expect. It makes perfect sense, does it not? 3 April perfumes, and I'm continuing with the same thought. This is not a new thought, this is the same thought, differently expressed. 3 April perfumes in 3 hot Junes burned. The perfume, the fragrance of April, when the flowers first bloom, they burn out in the sun of the hot June. Since first I saw you fresh, when you were really quite young, and I for the first time saw you, you were not only fresh in yourself because you were young, you were also fresh to me. It was the first time I saw you. Which yet are green, and you are still green, you are still young. So we also know that this is still early in the young man's life. And I have suggested before that they meet when the young man is really quite young, in his late teens, very, very early 20s, and this would still make sense now if I say this 3 years later. The young man may think, I've gone over a threshold, I've turned 21, I've become a grown-up, I've become an adult, a proper, responsible adult, even legally speaking. But actually, for me, the poet, he's still as young and still as beautiful. And I think this is probably true. I probably still see him as quite as beautiful as before, if not more so. Yet doth beauty, like a dial hand, steal from his figure, and no pace perceived. This is a metaphor of the sundial. The dial hand is the shadow that is thrown onto the dial by the gnomon, by the triangular bit. And this shadow, of course, if you look at it, you don't actually see it move. It seems to not be moving at all. No pace perceived. That means I don't perceive any motion. I don't perceive any pace in it. So your sweet hue literally is the color, but here abstracted as the color of your face, which methinks still doth stand, which I think doesn't change at all, hath motion, does actually move, has motion, it does actually change, motion is here, change. And mine eye may be deceived. I'm expressing this slightly more cautiously than I need to, because I know mine eye is deceived. For fear of which, and because of this, and fearing this to be the case, and I know it's the case, so I'm cheating a little bit, I'm playing a little bit of a mind game with myself. Hear this, thou age unbred. Thou age unbred is the generation of young people who haven't been born yet, and everybody who follows them, the generations to come, the ages of people yet to be born. Ere you were born was beauty's summer dead. Before you were even born, beauty's summer, the peak of beauty. Beauty's summer is the most fulsome expression of beauty, the summer of beauty. And we are, after all, in a poem all about the seasons, and the summer is the peak of the seasons, it's the fullness, it's when everything is at its best. Beauty's summer was dead before you were even born, because you, by implication, will be dead by then. Isn't that wonderful? I absolutely love this. Because it's not only an expression of devotion and loyalty and profound appreciation that goes beyond the first infatuation that we had. Because you remember the tone of the early sonnets, not the very first ones, not the procreation sonnets, but the "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day" sonnets. That was all the flush of first love. And here, this is a contemplation on the fact that this really is the best of your days. This is when you are in the full bloom of your beauty. And to me, that's still the case, and it has been the case since we first met. And I still love you and appreciate you and see you as beautiful as when I was in the first flush of infatuation. But I also know it will pass. The last word in this sonnet is dead. And it comes as a shock when we read it, doesn't it? To me, it comes as a shock when you read this gorgeous piece of poetry that seems to be saying all these beautiful things and these positive things and these felt and meant things. I think the contrast between something like this and the previous four, there is a real difference in quality to me, because this really sounds to me like it's coming from the heart, and it ends with the word dead. And I think this is, if it is not obviously semantically, consciously significant, I think this is subconsciously, emotionally significant. that this is how mature and how deep the relationship has become for me to be able to say this and assume, hope, expect it to be understood and taken in the right way by the young man. There is one more sonnet in this week's batch, and it's also an interesting one. It also would actually merit probably a whole episode in a way about it, but then which one of these doesn't? Well, some of them maybe wouldn't, but this one would merit a whole episode, which I'm not going to do. But let me mention it. It's interesting because it does something very unusual for these sonnets. It repeats the same phrase several times in a way that almost seems to be a chorus, almost as you would in a song. And also it does so very, very self-consciously, because it says, since all alike my songs and praises be, to one of one still such and ever so. And then I go on to say, fair, kind and true is all my argument. Fair, kind and true, varying to other words. And they repeat it again. Fair, kind, at the end in the final couplet, fair, kind and true have often lived alone, which three till now never kept seat in one. And the reason why this is interesting, apart from the repetitions and apart from the pattern, which is unusual, it is also interesting because I say fair, we've heard this a lot, kind, we've heard this on one or two occasions, and true, well, we've heard the absolute opposite to this. We've heard me, the poet, admonishing in very, very strong words the young man for being untrue, for being false, for getting off with my mistress. Here I say fair, kind and true, here are all in one, and they are in you. You are all of these things. And that's interesting because it makes the point, perhaps, or it seems to emphasize, it seems to reinforce the point, perhaps, that this relationship has entered a new phase. A relationship has entered a new stage where the tone can change and does change. What I'm saying in this particular sonnet here in 105 is not actually true if any of the other sonnets have been true. So some of these sonnets must be either presenting the fair youth in a better light than he generally is, than he truly is, or in a worse light than he truly is. They can't all be equally true. But what is interesting, of course, is not the factual matter. What's interesting is the emotional framework, is the sentiment. And the sentiment I by now expressed, having just told my young lover that he is still as beautiful to me as he was when I first met him, and that I first met him 3 years ago. I now say, you are fair, kind and true. All these things in one, and that's all I can really say about you. It is not all that I really say about you. There are more sonnets to come. And so I hope, of course, that you will stay with me as we explore the final phase of the Fair Youth sonnet. We are now at 105. There are not that many more to go, but there are some very beautiful sonnets still to come. And then we have the whole of the Dark Lady section waiting for us too. So remember, love is the power, and see you next week.